Bonjour, mon nom est Natacha Dubois. Avec ma collègue Martha Sellens, nous avons rédigé les nouvelles procédures de transfert pour les documents fédéraux, physiques et analogiques, c'est-à-dire pour tous les documents qui ne sont pas numériques. Mon collègue Brian Clark a fait le même exercice avec les procédures de transfert pour les documents fédéraux numériques. Il fait présentement partie de l'équipe qui rédige des outils d'orientation supplémentaires pour la norme opérationnelle sur les métadonnées des documents numériques archivistiques. Aujourd'hui, nous vous présentons les différents outils à votre disposition afin de bien préparer les documents pour leur transfert à BAC. Nous alternerons entre le français et l'anglais durant notre présentation. Et comme Francis vous l'a déjà dit, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions dans la langue officielle de votre choix, peu importe à quel présentateur elles sont destinées. Maintenant, allons voir ce qui s'est passé à BAC récemment pour les procédures de transfert. La ligne du temps que vous voyez sur la prochaine diapositive vous montre que depuis plusieurs années, quelques changements ont eu lieu à BAC concernant la façon dont on transfère les documents fédéraux. Et nous avons créé certains outils pour vous aider. En 2019, le formulaire de demande de transfert en ligne a été créé, remplaçant les demandes envoyées au centre de liaison ou directement à votre archiviste par courriel. Et dorénavant, vous recevez des notifications automatisées en lien avec le déroulement du processus de transfert. Ensuite, en 2023, la norme opérationnelle sur les métadonnées a été publiée. Elle présente les catégories minimales de métadonnées qui doivent accompagner les documents numériques pour leur transfert à BAC. En 2023-24, nous avons révisé en profondeur les procédures de transfert, autant pour les documents physiques, analogiques que numériques. Ces procédures dataient de 2014. Ça nous a permis clairement de les aligner avec nos pratiques et les exigences actuelles qui, elles, ont grandement changé depuis 10 ans. Également, d'autres changements ont eu lieu. Le gabarit d'inventaire a été modifié en 2022 et rendu disponible en ligne pour toutes les institutions du gouvernement du Canada. Le formulaire de demande de transfert en ligne a été amélioré à l'été 2024 pour s'aligner avec le vocabulaire et les nouvelles instructions des procédures. À nouveau, en 2025-26, le formulaire de demande de transfert en ligne devrait être modifié pour mieux accommoder les demandes de transfert numérique, ainsi que le formulaire d'évaluation de transfert numérique qui sera lui aussi modifié en conséquence. La publication de la norme opérationnelle sur les métadonnées et la révision des procédures de transfert avaient été annoncées lors de l'arrière-scène de la GI en octobre 2023. Puis, en novembre 2024, les principaux changements concernant les exigences pour le transfert des documents numériques à BAC avaient été présentés. La présentation d'aujourd'hui n'est évidemment pas une répétition de ces contenus. On va plutôt se concentrer sur l'utilisation des outils qui vous permettent d'effectuer les transferts à BAC. Tous les outils qu'on vous présente aujourd'hui sont disponibles sur notre site Internet. Et durant notre présentation, vous verrez comment ils sont utilisés pour vous permettre de préparer les documents pour le transfert à BAC. Maintenant, voyons voir la prochaine diapositive pour la structure de notre présentation. Nous allons utiliser 3 scénarios distincts. Le premier concerne les documents physiques et analogiques, tels que ceux que vous trouvez dans vos salles d'entreposage ou vos salles de dossier. Le second concerne les supports de stockage physiques pour les documents numériques, parfois trouvés avec les documents physiques et analogiques. Et le troisième scénario concerne les documents numériques qui sont gérés dans votre SGDDE. Chaque scénario présentera les principaux défis que vous risquez de rencontrer lorsque vous préparez les documents, ainsi que des pistes de solutions ou de réflexion pour aller au-delà de ces défis. Une chose à noter, c'est que vous composez probablement présentement avec les résultats d'un manque chronique de ressources en GI. Vous savez que le travail d'inventaire et de description de vos documents doit être fait à un moment ou à un autre afin de permettre leur disposition. Si ce n'est pas déjà le cas, vous réaliserez au cours de cette présentation que de mettre en place des bonnes pratiques de GI dès la création des documents vous sauve du temps et de l'énergie lorsque vous procédez à la disposition des documents. On ne peut pas retourner dans le passé, mais si vous implantez des bonnes pratiques de GI dès aujourd'hui, la disposition des documents de votre institution sera grandement facilitée dans le futur. Maintenant, allons voir le premier scénario que Martha va vous présenter.
Thank you. As Natasha mentioned, in the first scenario, we are talking about physical and analog records in this storage room. So we have this storage room here that needs to be cleared out, and you're not quite sure what is in the room. Maybe you need to clear it out because you're moving buildings or you're renovating. The institution is being reorganized, and so programs and therefore the records related to them are being switched between teams. Or maybe you've just finally gotten to this item on your endless to-do list, in which case, congratulations, that's amazing. But whatever the reason, our goal here is to make sure that you are disposing of the records appropriately and as efficiently as possible. Over the next few slides, I'm going to go over the information about the records that you need to provide to Library and Archives Canada, the types of records that you might find, and some tips and tricks for how to identify them and pack them correctly for transfer to LAC. And then Natasha will do a run through of the tools available on our website, which you will be using as part of the transfer process to get us all of the required information. So in this slide, I'm actually on the previous slide. Sorry, AV team. So in our storage room here, where should we start? Our primary question is, what are they? Neither of us can make informed decisions about these records if we don't know what they are. And we also want to use our limited resources as efficiently as possible. So the first step is, what are the records? Before proposing records for transfer, you need enough information to determine whether you, the institution, still need to keep the records for some reason. So have they met their retention? Have you satisfied your own disposition process, or do you have all of the information that you need in order to do so? Are there any legal restraints, like a litigation hold or a regulatory requirement that might prevent you? Or any other government policies or procedures from Treasury Board or other authorities which would prevent you from transferring records to LAC? And then on the other side, you also need to know whether the records are archival and should be transferred. This is where us LAC archivists come in. And like you, we also need enough information to assess the archival value of these records in this room. As you know, LAC uses disposition authorizations and application guides to identify which records are archival. These are generally created specifically for your institution. So always start by reading through the application guides that have been provided to you, as they may provide you with the information you need to determine the record's archival value. If anything is unclear, talk to your assigned archivist, and they'll be able to help you figure that out. On our side, we also use these same tools at point of transfer to confirm that the records are archival before we approve your transfer request in the system. So these conversations can also be useful for us, since we also have to have that mapping between the specific records you're proposing and the identification of archival records that we've already done. So I've mentioned this, what is enough information is what we need at this stage. Well, what is enough? It depends. Always start with the basics here. So who, what, and when, and try to be as specific as you can. And then in your conversation with your archivist, the archivist will let you know whether you need a bit more information, and we may also be able to provide some suggestions on how to find that information if you don't already have it. So for the who, in the worst case scenario, who will be the institution? Yourself, your institution. But you may also have more specific information, the team, the division, or a program area that has created these records themselves. Check the boxes, see what's on the labels on the outside, see if there's anything on the file jackets themselves, and if there are acronyms, try to look them up to see what they might be. But if you only have the acronym, also provide that to us. We may be able to figure it out. What type of records are these? Are they scientific reports? Are they application files, meeting minutes? Is it just a mix of a whole bunch of different kinds of records that are all from the same business area? Sometimes you won't be able to tell, and that's all right. But tell us what you can. And if you know the business area, at least try to give us an idea of what they were responsible for, so we can get a sense of what the records might be. And for when, you may need to sample a few of the files in the individual boxes in order to get a sense of the date range that we're dealing with here. But in this case, an estimate is all right. It's better than nothing. So if, for example, you know that this is a storage room that was in active use from 1960 to 1980, and that no one has added any records to it since that time, then you can provide the date as before 1980 and explain to us how you came to that conclusion. At this stage, even if you're lucky enough to have a full inventory of the records in this storage room, you may not have this sort of aggregate level summary of who, what, and when available as part of that listing. So, and that summary is actually what's most important for us to determine the context of the records and their potential archival value. So it's useful to gather that's even if you do have an inventory at this stage. Once you've determined that your institution doesn't still need to keep the records and that they are archival and LAC would like you to transfer them, now it's time to go to the next step and make sure that you're meeting all of LAC's transfer requirements and get ready to submit a request to LAC. Next slide. The transfer requirements are, of course, listed in the procedures that we recently renewed. But as Natasha will demonstrate in a few minutes, the transfer web form and the inventory template are designed to allow you to provide us with all of this information. And even in the case of our sort of mystery boxes in this storage room, you may find that you have already gathered quite a bit of this information that is required as part of confirming that the records are in fact ready to be transferred, both on your end and on ours. In the interest of time, I won't go through the list of information in detail, but you can find that required information listed in section 6.2.2 of the transfer procedures. Of course, for our storage room example, we are referring to the physical and analog transfer procedures, but you should be aware that it's the exact same number as the requirements in the digital procedures as well, and the only differences between the two are based off of this format-specific requirements that we have for the information. So we at LAC need this information in order to continue managing these records and to ensure that we can provide access to them to Canadians now and in the future. Broadly speaking, the information that we're asking for, this required information, falls into two main categories. The first one would be the intellectual management of the records, and this is that what are they piece with a few extra levels of detail compared to what we were doing in the initial stages here. For example, it's extremely important that you provide the security classification information or anything else that might affect the appropriate access or use of the records. And it's equally important as well to let us know if the records that you are transferring have already been made available to the public, since that takes a big burden off of our ATIP staff, and that is something we very much appreciate. Another example of appropriate access and use of records is that if you have records where the copyright is not held by the Crown, or even just anything with a very high monetary value, it's especially important to let us know in those cases because that's not typical of most government records, and we want to make sure that we're managing them appropriately. The second category of information that we require is about the physical management of the records. So this is most often related to preservation of the actual physical objects themselves that are being transferred to us to reduce any long-term harms that might come to them, but it's also part of sort of the practical necessity of managing the records themselves. How many boxes are there? How big are they? Things that we need to know in order to arrange the logistics of a pickup and also to plan our storage space within our own facilities. For both types of information, some of which you will be able to to include it directly into the transfer web form. But the inventory itself is the most important piece of supporting documentation for the records, both for the intellectual and the physical management, because it explains what the records are and which specific records, which files or items are in which specific container. So we can adequately do both types of management over the course of the record's lifecycle. And as you're creating an inventory, it by necessity goes hand in hand with that sort of packing and repacking of material in preparation for transfer. Since if you find something new, you'll have to let us know about it, and then you'll have to update the container numbers or the titles of the files. And it's a bit circular and goes back and forth, but that's still a very important key part of the process. LAC's packaging, packing, and labeling requirements are available in Appendix C of the physical and analog transfer procedures, and we can also provide training to you upon request. So when you take a look at that section of the transfer procedures, you'll notice up at the top, there's a note letting you know that LAC may require different packaging have different requirements depending on the records proposed for transfer. Don't worry about this. This is just to account for the breadth of variables that can go into determining the best course of action for long-term preservation. So as always, talk to your archivist and we'll be able to have a discussion about the specific needs of the records in question. In our storage room, for example, there might be a few areas that could use some special instructions. Even without looking inside any of the boxes, you may have noticed that there were a few oversized containers. So the first step there, when we're deciding whether or not anything needs to be done, is to look inside and consult with your archivist about what you find. A few different options of how we would have to proceed. You may find that the records inside these oversized boxes will fit safely inside of a more standard sized container, like a B30, in which case, that is what we will instruct you to do. You might need to use a different type or size of container, in which case we will advise you on what that is and where you might be able to purchase it. Or finally, the existing container might be good enough. And either that's good enough for the long-term preservation of the records, or it's just good enough for that transfer of those records to LAC, where staff, myself or one of my colleagues, will be making a specialized container for the long-term storage of those records. We're not in the business of getting you to do extra work if we're just going to redo it ourselves. And for the other boxes, you'll notice that they are all in, most of them are all in these banker's box style boxes with a lid. That is not an accepted box for transfer to LAC. So they will all need to be rehoused into likely the standard B30s that we describe in Appendix C. But as you're repacking all of these boxes, watch out for any different kind of media mixed in with your regular paper files. Appendix C is a table of the common media types you may encounter with some considerations and requirements from LAC for those media types. But the basics of it is anytime you encounter another media type, you must contact your archivist, especially when it's mixed in with other paper files, so that we can determine whether those media need to be segregated from your paper files. And the reason why we might segregate media is for preservation needs. Different media have different requirements. Some need to be stored in different temperatures or different humidity levels, or even just in a different type of container so that they're not rubbing up against the paper that's in the standard file. And that's just to prevent damage. So as you're going through creating an inventory or repackaging boxes of any kind, you don't need to check every single file or page, but there are a few things to look out for. And if you notice them, you can look a little bit closer and then talk to us about what you find. One thing to look out for are accordion files, especially those with a flap over the top. We may know them as wallets or pockets. They don't always have other types of media inside them, but they do often enough that it's worth taking a look inside those pockets to see what you have. And then also, you may just be able to tell based off of look, feel, smell, just anything that's a little bit different from a standard letter or legal size piece of paper. You can get color, texture, all sorts of different things. So just keep your eye out for that. And on the next slide, I'm going to quickly go through a few of the different media types and some media-specific advice for what to look out for in case you might have it in your records. So with photographs, you might see plastic or paper sleeves over top of prints or negatives, or even envelopes that aren't the same size as, again, standard paper. And you also may be able to smell them. Photographs are made with a variety of different chemical processes, and sometimes that comes across as a smell that remains in them. With photographs, especially if you smell vinegar, that's especially important to note because it likely means that the negatives or the prints are deteriorating, and we'll need to do a damage assessment to see what is going on with those records as part of the transfer process. Some formats are fragile or flammable when it comes to photographs, especially some types of negatives. So always make sure to check with us. And also always wear nitrile gloves and handle any prints or negatives from the edges of the image. Next slide. Maps, plans, and technical drawings or architectural plans are often printed on oversized sheets. So for these types of records, definitely keep an eye out for oversized containers or items that are folded or rolled to fit inside a smaller container. If you do encounter anything that's folded or rolled, be very careful as you are handling those items, especially when they get older, they can become quite brittle and it becomes very easy to tear or damage the records as you're handling them. So if you notice any damage occurring as you are trying to open records to view what they are, just stop. Don't force anything and contact LAC and we'll let you know what the appropriate course of action is to handle those records. Some of these records are also created with chemical processes, especially blueprints, or are printed on a different type of material like vellum or mylar, both of which can occasionally off-gas and have a bit of a smell. So that's another thing to smell out for as you are looking for records of this type. Next slide. It's very, very difficult to make any general statements about art and object because they are so varied in how they need to be handled. So a watercolor, a metal seal, and a pencil sketch should not be treated in the same way. So if you find any art within the files that you are going through, always, always, always contact your assigned archivist, and we'll make sure to get the right information from our specialists at LAC to give you the correct instructions for your specific type of art. Art can be very fragile, so again, always wear nitrile gloves and handle from the edges to avoid any damage to the image. Next slide. For AV records, they come in a very wide variety of formats and sizes. So some will be immediately obvious when you open a box, like one of these film reels, whereas others might hide more easily within a paper file or one of the wallets I mentioned earlier. So pay attention as you're going through to see what you can find. Again, it will be the sort of plastic feel of the carrier or metal in some cases. And again, especially with film, you may have that smell that I mentioned earlier with other format media as well. I will also note some AV formats are obsolete or endangered. And since they are not human eye readable, there's a lot more work that goes into preserving the content of these records. So it's essential that we identify them at point of transfer, since what is readable now may no longer be readable in the next year or in the next 5, never mind in 50 or 100. So always, always, always let us know when you have AV records. And next slide. And the last type of format that I will briefly discuss are digital carriers, especially anything small like floppy disks or CDRs, CD-ROMs that are very easy to miss when tucked inside a regular paper file of records. Like with AV, these formats can deteriorate quite quickly. So you need to take action to protect the contents before they are lost, when it may already be too late, but we'll see what we can do. Brian will talk more about these digital records in scenario 2, so stay tuned on that one. Next slide. Okay, so that may have been a lot of information. It was a lot of information. And next, Natasha will show you LAC's website and tools, which will lead you through providing all of the required information we just discussed as part of that transfer. But before she does that, I just want to emphasize the most important point for you to take from our presentation here, which is talk to your archivist. We're only part of the way through the presentation today, and already I have said talk to your archivist at least 9 times, and you will hear it again many times before we are done today. So feel free to play along at home and keep a tally if you like. The reality of records and information management in the GC is very complex. And as a result, there often aren't simple standard solutions that we can provide. So we've tried to give you as much as we can in terms of basic answers to everything. But at the end of the day, sometimes the decisions we make or the answers we provide will be as unique as the records you are discussing. I will add another minor nuance here as well, since I know we have a very large audience today. If you're not part of your institution's IM team, please talk to them as well before contacting LAC. It's important not to circumvent your IM colleagues because, as I mentioned briefly earlier, there are important parts of your internal disposition process that we can't advise you on. And they may also already have the answers to your questions. Your IM team has expertise and knowledge that is useful for you, which I don't have, in the same way as I have expertise and knowledge on archival records that they don't. So for those of you who are not IM professionals, talk to your IM is just as equally important as talk to your archivist. If you're ever in any doubt, whether you are a member of IM staff or not, please do reach out to your assigned archivist or to the liaison center if you don't know who is the assigned archivist. But just keep in mind that we may redirect you to your IM team first, or for a large IM team to the main contacts that we speak with on a regular basis as an essential source of information for you to consult first before discussing further with us. And now I will hand it over to Natasha, who will show you the tools on LAC's website that will help you meet all the requirements for transferring records to LAC. Natasha, à vous.
Merci, Martha. Donc, vous avez des documents à transférer. Vous avez parlé à votre archiviste à bac. Là, on est rendu à 10 fois. Vous avez rassemblé toute l'information nécessaire au sujet des documents. Vous êtes maintenant rendu à l'étape de la création de l'inventaire qui doit respecter les exigences de bac. Là, on va aller voir sur notre site web où on trouve ça, ce fameux inventaire-là, qui était bien caché et qu'on a amélioré l'accès. Donc, à partir de notre site web, vous devez descendre donc la page d'accueil du site web. Vous devez descendre jusqu'à tout sur nos services. Puis, services pour le gouvernement du Canada. Ensuite, gestion de l'information et disposition des documents gouvernementaux. Il y a différentes choses ici sur cette page-là. Brian va vous en parler un petit peu plus tout à l'heure, mais C'est une bonne page pour aller si vous travaillez en gestion de l'information ou si vous voulez aller avoir plus d'informations là-dessus. Nous, on va aller à la demande de transfert des documents fédéraux. Donc, dans le haut de cette page-là, vous avez maintenant, ça, ce sont parmi les changements qu'on a fait cet été, vous avez une série d'hyperliens vers les différents outils dont on vous parle aujourd'hui. Les 2 procédures de transfert pour les documents physiques et analogiques et pour les documents numériques. Le gabarit d'inventaire dont je vous parle dans une minute et le formulaire de transfert, le formulaire d'évaluation de transfert numérique et la norme opérationnelle sur les métadonnées dont Brian va vous parler après la petite démonstration que je fais là. Donc, là, on est dans le formulaire, le fameux formulaire de demande de transfert en ligne dont on vous parle depuis tantôt. On va commencer par aller voir l'inventaire lui-même. Donc, c'est un beau fichier Excel. Donc, gabarit d'inventaire, c'est un modèle. Vous pouvez utiliser directement ce modèle-là pour créer votre liste de dossiers, de documents ou d'items que vous voulez transférer à BAC. Vous n'êtes absolument pas obligé d'utiliser ce modèle-là, ce gabarit lui-même. Cependant, l'information que vous fournissez à BAC doit correspondre aux exigences minimales que vous avez dans ce document-là. Par exemple, si vous avez un système qui est capable de vous extraire une série de titres de dossiers, de numéros, de dates en Excel, ça va très bien fonctionner. Il faut juste vous assurer que tout fonctionne. Vous n'êtes pas obligé d'utiliser absolument ce fichier-là. Également, un peu comme Martha vous parlait pour l'emballage des documents dans des boîtes spécialisées, c'est possible que votre archiviste, lui, vous donne des instructions différentes de ce que vous allez trouver ici. Parfois, on va vous demander plus d'informations quand c'est disponible. Parfois, on va vous demander de l'information différente parce que ce que vous nous transférez ne rentre pas tout à fait parfaitement dans une des catégories qu'on a là. Donc, d'abord, l'onglet Instructions. Si vous n'avez jamais utilisé le gabarit, je vous invite à le lire. Il n'est pas très long, quelques lignes de lecture ici, ça va très bien. Ensuite, vous allez voir qu'il y a un onglet pour chacun des types de supports visuels. Chacun des types de supports. Par exemple, le document textuel, qui est le plus courant encore aujourd'hui. Oups, excusez-moi de vous étourdir. Vous avez des colonnes dont l'entête est en bleu. Si je vais dans le suivant, vous allez voir qu'il y a des colonnes dont l'entête est en blanc. Les entêtes bleues, ce sont des informations obligatoires que vous devez nous fournir. Donc, dans quel contenant, dans quelle boîte vous avez emballé le document, s'il y a un numéro de dossier, un numéro de volume, titre de dossier, les dates, etc. Une des informations très importantes, c'est la catégorie de sécurité. Pour chacune des lignes, donc pour chaque dossier ou chaque item que vous nous transférez, vous devez nous indiquer son niveau de classification, son niveau de catégorie de sécurité. Donc, ça, c'est super important. Ce que vous allez compléter ici, disons que vous avez du textuel, vous avez trouvé quelques photographies et vous avez trouvé, par exemple, 2 cassettes vidéo. Vous devez remplir les 3 onglets et ceci doit aussi se reproduire dans le formulaire de transfert en ligne. Donc, on va retourner, disons que vous avez fait l'inventaire, tout est prêt, vous avez rempli le fichier Excel. Là, vous êtes prêt à aller faire votre demande officielle de transfert de documents. Donc, dans le formulaire, comme dans la plupart de ces formulaires-là en ligne que vous connaissez tous, un petit astérisque rouge veut dire que c'est un champ obligatoire et il y en a beaucoup. Également, vous allez avoir à certains endroits des points d'interrogation qui vous donnent un peu plus de détails sur ce qu'on s'attend comme réponse ou des critères sur comment vous devez répondre à la question ou ce que vous devez inscrire dans le champ. Très, très, très important, et c'est indiqué aussi en haut, il n'est pas possible de sauvegarder le formulaire dans le but de le compléter ultérieurement. C'est pour ça que c'est important d'avoir toute l'information que Martha vous a demandé de ramasser. Vous devez avoir toute cette information-là et votre inventaire doit être prêt. Donc, parce que vous ne pouvez pas sauvegarder ça et y revenir, il faut que ce soit fait d'un coup. Donc, la première partie, information sur la personne ressource, je ne m'arrête même pas dessus, c'est quelque chose que vous connaissez. Vous savez comment répondre à ça. La section, le détail sur les documents proposés pour le transfert. Dans le cas du nom du créateur, c'est seulement on vous le demande seulement dans le cas où vous voudriez transférer des documents qui vous ont été donnés par une autre institution. Vous avez hérité de documents d'un prédécesseur ou d'une institution défunte, mais vous transférez en leur nom. Fait qu'il faut indiquer de qui ça vient, qui a créé les documents. Le numéro d'autorisation de disposition, il est obligatoire. C'est celui qui est en vigueur pour votre institution et qui justifie la demande de transfert. Nous, ça nous permet de faire à la relation et de confirmer que c'est bien archivistique. Contexte intellectuel des documents, toutes les informations que vous avez rassemblées tantôt qui ne peuvent pas apparaître vraiment dans l'inventaire, vous les mettez là. Créateur, les dates extrêmes, toutes les informations que vous pouvez trouver sur le contexte des documents. Ici, veuillez spécifier la quantité de contenant de chaque taille, même si la quantité est 0. C'est très important d'indiquer un chiffre dans chaque ligne, même si c'est 0, parce que le calcul se fait tout seul. Disons que vous en avez 20 ici, puis vous avez un A ici. Il faut quand même indiquer 0 partout, sinon le formulaire se sauvegardera pas. On vous indique ici, particulièrement, c'est quoi une B30? On vous en parle depuis tantôt. Ce sont les mesures maximales que vous voyez là. Pourquoi on est si exigeant pour la grosseur des B30? C'est que, entre autres, notre nouvel édifice d'entreposage à Gatineau, le Cube, a des étagères fixes qui contiennent des tablettes. Il n'y a rien qui bouge. C'est fixe, les espaces qu'on a, on ne peut pas les modifier. Et il y a un certain nombre de B30 qui rentrent sur chaque tablette. Si vos B30 sont finalement des B31 parce qu'elles sont juste un petit peu plus larges, ben on n'est plus capable d'en rentrer 6. Il faut en rentrer juste 5 et là, on perd de l'espace. Donc, soyez bien attentifs aux mesures des boîtes que vous commandez et que vous nous envoyez. Les B10, B15, B20, ce sont d'autres types de boîtes. C'est des contenants spécialisés. Votre archiviste va vous en parler s'il y a lieu. Tout ce qui n'est pas une de ces 4-là, c'est un contenant non standard. Un peu plus grand, un peu plus petit, très long, très large, très haut, c'est du non standard. Si vous indiquez du non standard, vous devez nous fournir les dimensions. Bien sûr, comme ça, nous, on sait quand on va les ramasser de quoi elles ont l'air et pour l'entreposage. Ensuite, certains des documents transférés sont-ils numériques? Si vous cliquez oui, il y a des champs qui vont apparaître. Brian va vous en parler tantôt. On va garder ça à non pour l'instant. On va se contenter du physique ici. Ensuite, spécifier les numéros de contenants pour chaque type de support. Tantôt, on a dit qu'on avait 21 boîtes. Donc, je sais que les boîtes 1 à 20, j'avais du textuel dedans parce que c'est ce que j'ai écrit dans mon inventaire. J'ai des photos dans la boîte 15. J'ai 3 photos. Mon archiviste m'a dit de les laisser là. Il n'y a pas de problème. Mais j'ai la boîte 21 qui, elle, contient des films ou des VHS. Donc, c'est important de mettre les numéros qui correspondent à ce qui est écrit dans votre inventaire. Les numéros de référence archivistique et le nombre de volumes, si ça ne vous dit rien, c'est que votre archiviste ne vous en a pas parlé. Si votre archiviste vous en parle, il va vous donner exactement quoi écrire là-dedans. On revient à la catégorie de sécurité. Cette fois-ci, on vous demande la plus haute pour l'ensemble du transfert. Donc, ça peut être protégé B, ça peut être non classifié, ça peut être secret. Si par hasard, c'est très secret, vous allez avoir une petite note qui vous dit que les documents très secrets doivent être ségrégés, doivent être séparés des autres documents parce qu'on les entrepose ailleurs. Ils ne sont pas dans nos voûtes régulières. L'inventaire du matériel proposé pour le transfert. Est-ce que certains de ces documents ont été ouverts par la IPRP? Si c'est oui, on vous demande dans l'inventaire d'indiquer lesquels sont ouverts, quel dossier spécifique, quel contenant complet. Vous pouvez ajouter une colonne dans l'inventaire sans problème pour indiquer ça. Ce n'est pas un cas qui est nécessairement prévu à chaque fois, donc on n'a pas mis de colonne pour ça. Pouvez-vous soumettre l'inventaire avec cette demande? La réponse devrait être oui. À ce stade-ci, vous avez encore l'hyperlien vers le gabarit d'inventaire, mais il est déjà fait. Vous joignez le fichier. Un seul fichier peut être joint. Si pour une raison ou pour une autre, vous avez plusieurs fichiers d'inventaire, vous pouvez nous les envoyer par courriel et il faudra indiquer dans le champ en dessous que vous nous avez envoyé 1, 2, 3 fichiers par courriel. en plus de celui qui est là. Ça peut aussi arriver que le fichier ne peut pas être ajouté au site web parce que le système ne prend que les documents protégés B ou moins. Et ça arrive que dans certains inventaires, vous avez, même juste au niveau du nom du fichier, du dossier ou du titre ou du numéro, ça peut être de l'information qui est classifiée ou qui est protégée C. Donc, vous ne pouvez pas joindre le document. À ce moment-là, il y a d'autres moyens de l'envoyer à votre archiviste par des canaux sécurisés. Et c'est là que la réponse ici serait non. Ça ne peut pas être soumis pour des raisons de sécurité, a été envoyé à l'archiviste. Autrement, la seule réponse qu'on ne veut pas avoir ici, c'est l'inventaire n'existe pas. C'est une réponse qu'on ne veut pas, puisque vous êtes censé en avoir fait un. Et finalement, on arrive à la fin. Les 3 dernières cases qui sont à cocher obligatoirement, qui confirment que les documents sont bel et bien prêts à être transférés, que vous pouvez les transférer et que c'est maintenant BAC qui va en avoir le contrôle. Et vous soumettez la demande. Donc, on a fait le tour de ça. On a parlé des documents physiques analogiques, mais tout à l'heure, je vous ai parlé, on a trouvé des disquettes dans vos boîtes. Et qu'est-ce qu'on va faire avec ça? Bien, maintenant, ça, c'est Brian qui va tout vous présenter ça. Tout ce qu'on fait avec le numérique. Brian?
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. So, as Natasha mentioned, I will be speaking to you about 2 more scenarios that involve digital records from 2 different perspectives. So, as we've mentioned, you've gone through your physical and analog records. You find one of these. After taking some time to revel in the nostalgia, you're left wondering what to do about this floppy disk. First things first, we should see if we can glean any information from the disk itself. Does it have any identification information on a label? Did it come out of a paper file? Getting a sense of all the physical context in which you found the floppy or other physical carrier is an important first bit of information to provide your archivist. In some cases, this may be enough for your archivist to determine if the digital records on this carrier are archival. Let's assume, for example, that the disk came out of a paper file that was previously identified as archival. The digital records on that disk are likely also archival and should be brought into a modern digital environment prior to transfer to LAC. But what does this mean? First, it is the department's responsibilities to extract the data from the disk and either into a modern record-keeping system or in such a case where the records are being prepared for transfer immediately, migrated over onto one of LAC's approved storage media listed in the transfer procedures, namely a USB key or an external hard drive. Some of you may have the hardware on site to do this, but I imagine many of you may need to explore contracting a third party to extract the data from a legacy carrier and transfer it over onto one of these approved storage media for transfer. Keep in mind that this migration is not a simple copy-paste. It needs to be done using appropriate migration tools to ensure that all the embedded metadata, such as created dates, is preserved. So once you've done this, you've migrated the records and you open them up and you see what is on the disk, you realize that the records are related to a short-lived but important project in your department from the early 1990s. Your archivist will need as much contextual information as you can gather about this project, the same who, when, and what information that Martha was talking about earlier. So for such a project, maybe its mandate, its scope, some important dates, and in this case, you can also add a snapshot of what you found on the disk, whether that's a high-level folder structure or list of the records on the disk. Next slide. Maintenant, supposons que l'archiviste ait confirmé que tous les documents sur la disquette sont archivistiques. Que faisons-nous ensuite? Pour commencer, une seule copie de chaque document devrait être transférée à BAC. Nous devrons nous assurer que ces documents ne sont pas des doublons. Il y a 2 niveaux à ce défi. Premièrement, assurez-vous qu'il n'y a pas de duplication sur la disquette elle-même. Il existe de nombreux logiciels qui peuvent vous aider avec cette tâche. Si vous souhaitez des recommandations, veuillez contacter votre archiviste qui pourra mettre en conversation avec les experts à BAC. Deuxièmement, nous devons nous assurer qu'il n'y a pas de duplication avec des documents dans d'autres systèmes de documents, de gestion de documents qui incluent vos documents papier. Étant donné que la disquette provenait d'un dossier papier, faites simplement un examen rapide de ce dossier pour vous assurer qu'il ne s'agit pas d'un de ces scénarios où on a imprimé des documents pour les classer au dossier tout en conservant la version numérique. Vous voudrez aussi vérifier si une version papier de ces documents ne sont pas déjà à BAC. Ici, votre archiviste peut vous aider. Même après ces vérifications, nous ne pourrons jamais être sûrs d'avoir épuisé toutes les possibilités de duplication. Cependant, nous voulons simplement nous assurer de faire une vérification raisonnable pour garantir la déduplication des documents avant le transfert. Ensuite, il est temps d'évaluer les formats de fichiers. Je souligne pour transférer des documents numériques, ils doivent être dans un format de fichier favorisé ou acceptable selon nos lignes directrices que je vais vous montrer bientôt. Il y a des outils gratuits comme Droid qui est développé par les Archives nationales du Royaume-Uni qui peut vous aider en identifiant tous les formats de fichiers dans une collection numérique et vous aider à isoler les zones problématiques potentielles à traiter. Par exemple, vous pouvez rencontrer des formats anciens comme les fichiers WordPerfect. Vous devrez convertir ces fichiers en format moderne comme une doc ou un PDF pour garantir leur capacité pour la préservation et pour l'accès dans le futur. Pour certains problèmes de format, il existe de nombreux outils disponibles pour vous aider à migrer vers un format acceptable. Dans d'autres cas, comme avec les formats propriétaires, cela peut être beaucoup plus difficile. Alors, veuillez nous parler tout au long de ce processus. Nous savons que traiter les formats de fichiers anciens est l'un des aspects les plus délicats de ces collections numériques. Donc, une fois que les documents numériques eux-mêmes sont prêts à être transférés, c'est-à-dire il n'y a pas de doublons et tous les problèmes de format de fichiers sont résolus, nous pouvons commencer à préparer la documentation de transfert. Comme pour les transferts physiques et analogiques, vous devez fournir un inventaire de ces documents. Puisqu'il s'agit d'une seule disquette dans notre scénario hypothétique, vous n'aurez pas besoin d'une seule ligne dans votre inventaire. Votre archivistique demanderait des métadonnées minimales sur cette ligne qui incluent généralement les mêmes informations que vous venez de voir dans la démonstration de Natasha. Par exemple, le numéro et titre de dossier dans lequel vous avez trouvé la disquette, la catégorie de sécurité et de date. Enfin, vous vous posez peut-être des questions à propos de notre norme opérationnelle sur les métadonnées. Nous savons que dans telle situation, vous n'aurez pas beaucoup de métadonnées supplémentaires sur ces documents. Heureusement, si vous remplissez les documents requis pour le transfert, vous satisferez déjà les exigences minimales de métadonnées de BAC. Mais j'en parlerai en détail bientôt. Prochaine diapo. Passons maintenant à un autre scénario impliquant des documents numériques, que vous connaissez probablement mieux. Des documents récents qui viennent de dépasser leur délai de conservation, mais qui ont été gérés dans un système de gestion de documents modernes comme RDIMS, GCDocs, SharePoint ou M365. Étant donné que ces documents ont été gérés activement et de manière saine, une grande partie de la préparation devrait être plus simple. Cependant, les récents transferts vers BAC impliquant des documents gérés dans ce système ont mis en évidence quelques défis uniques dont j'aimerais vous parler maintenant. Prochaine diapo. By now, you should fully expect what the first step of the transfer preparation should be. Talk to your archivist. In this case, though, much of the information we require can probably be generated through extracting some sort of disposition report or digital object inventory directly from your system. Additionally, this type of object inventory may later also act as the official transfer inventory, though probably with some additions or edits that I will talk about shortly. With digital records coming out of an electronic record-keeping system, you may also need to provide your archivist with additional information to help them interpret the records or the list. Things like code books, data dictionaries, or other reference materials related to how the record-keeping system works are crucial bits of information for us to do our jobs. Now, this type of object list or disposition report may be enough for your archivist to confirm if the records are in fact archival and eligible for transfer to LAC. Additionally, archivists can confer with other subject matter experts in the institution, such as those in digital preservation, to ensure that we are not foreseeing any technical issues with the transfer. If so, we can deal with those early, preferably before you fully extract the records out of your system. Once you've confirmed with your archivist that the files are archival and eligible for transfer, you will need to extract the records out of the system, again onto an LAC-approved carrier for transfer. However, I will take this moment to mention two things. One, LAC can provide a hard drive for you if you'd like. Just let your archivist know. Second, we don't have a current business line for direct transfers. However, we are exploring this capability on a pilot basis. If you're interested, again, talk to your archivist and we can provide you with more details. However, much of the following preparatory work will remain the same, other than the obvious step of loading the records onto a physical carrier. Extracting records from a modern system can sometimes be difficult, sometimes straightforward, depending on the system. However, sometimes there are complex relationships between the records, like approval tracking, that need to be well documented in the metadata list and maintained during extraction. So talk to your IT staff for guidance here. As with the last scenario involving the floppy disk, you will need to ensure that the file formats are suitable for long-term preservation and check for duplicates. However, these issues can be made much easier by building the appropriate rules into a modern record-keeping system. Lastly, these types of systems will have much more robust metadata than older legacy digital records. We can assume as a starting point that you will probably have met the minimal requirements for transfer to LAC. However, just because we've met the minimal metadata doesn't necessarily mean that's all we want to acquire with the records. It's possible, even likely, that additional and full metadata might be useful to provide additional context for the records. For example, things like approval history or access permissions can help us provide necessary contextual information when cataloging the records or reduce ATIP work for providing access further down the line. Now I'll come back to the transfer documentation. Can that disposition report or digital object inventory that your system spits out be used in place of the file inventory that you had to create in the first two scenarios? Well, maybe. It depends. As Natasha mentioned earlier, our procedures don't specify that you must use our inventory template, but if you use something else, it must be in Excel and it must contain all the same information. So I would recommend looking at what the default metadata extract from your system looks like and read it against the template on the transfer web form to see if it contains the same information. In my experience, it usually does. Most systems have dates, titles, security classification information. However, sometimes things like file titles are missing. So your archivist may ask you to manually add some information in order to accept this list as the inventory to attach on the transfer request, as Natasha showed you earlier. And now I'll switch over to the screen share, please. So one thing I haven't spoken a ton about today yet is LAC's operational metadata standard. The reason for this is I want to give a practical example of how you might consult this tool when preparing your records for transfer. You can find this tool on our website. If you recall, Natasha brought you to this page on information management and disposition of government records. She brought you directly over to the request to transfer government records, but for our purposes, we will go to this first link on managing government records, and then guidelines for information management. And you will be brought to a page with all of our policy tools that implicate transferring government records. You'll see the transfer procedures that were updated last year, as well as the file format guidelines that I mentioned earlier that you can use to see if your records are in a preferred or acceptable file format for transfer. Right now, we're going to go look at the operational standard for digital archival records metadata. As a reminder, this metadata standard lays out 12 concepts or categories that are required to be included with archival government records. However, this does not mean that every digital object must be tagged with all 12 concepts. There are different levels of aggregation at which they are required on individual items or aggregations such as files or folders, or the transfer as a whole. Appendix E summarizes the level of requirement for each of the 12 concepts and may be helpful to use as a sort of checklist when preparing records for transfer. So let's take a look at the past two scenarios to see how they both may meet the minimal requirements laid out in this table, but in different ways. For example, classification code typically refers to a file number connected to your record-keeping manual. You can see here that it is mandatory where present for items. This means that for the records like those maintained in an EDRMS, where each object is likely tagged with the classification code, that becomes required. Luckily, you'll have already provided us with this if you had submitted that object inventory we discussed earlier. For the floppy disk, however, we're not expecting classification code to be present at the item level. So if you continued through the table to the right, you'll notice that classification code becomes mandatory for aggregations or for groups of records. In the case we discussed above, a file number and file title from the paper file the floppy came out of, or maybe written on the label of the disk itself, is sufficient to meet this mandatory for aggregations requirement. And this information would have already been included in the file inventory you would submit with the transfer. It is a similar story for creator metadata. We know that systems like GC Docs will have robust creator metadata at the item level. It is mandatory where present for items, so we'll want that. However, for something like the floppy disk, you'll see that the creator metadata is only mandatory for transfers, which means that when you submit that web form Natasha showed you, you'll be asked some basic information about the business unit that created the records that are being transferred. If we scroll down to language for another example, this is only mandatory when present for items and not mandatory at any other level. This means that where your system includes item level language metadata, please include it in the inventory you send us. But we know that won't be present in cases like the floppy disk scenario, so we won't ask for it. Most of the metadata concepts that are always required at the item level, such as date, time, format, and title, are metadata that will be part of the computer file itself. So while they were always required at an item level, you typically don't need to do much extra work when preparing for transfer. However, during the management of the record, you just need to be sure that this metadata doesn't get overwritten. Say, for example, date metadata being overwritten during system migrations. If you suspect that the embedded metadata is inaccurate for any reason, please speak with your archivist so we can try to figure out a suitable alternative. Some metadata concepts are only required at the transfer level. For example, disposition authorization will need to be included in the transfer web form, while the total of extent of the transfer will be documented in the digital transfer assessment form that I will show you briefly. The reason that I show you this table and worked through it in such detail is to reflect that if you are filling out the required transfer documentation, you will have likely met the minimal requirements laid out in the operational standards shown here. One concept that I've not mentioned yet is the integrity concept. You'll notice the big asterisk next to it. This reflects that this metadata is only required at the point of transfer and not throughout the life cycle of the archival record. So in other words, we do require at the point of transfer for you to include an integrity check or checksum, which we can verify once we have the records in our control to ensure nothing was corrupted in transit. For the sake of time, I won't go into any details about checksums, but if you don't know how to run them, please reach out to your archivist. We have several staff at LAC who have lots of experience with this requirement. So now that we've ensured that the records are archival and are healthy digital records with the required metadata and inventories included, let's return to the web form that Natasha showed you earlier. If you recall, there was a question about whether the proposed transfer contained digital records. We will obviously select yes. In the two scenarios we have discussed, we have migrated your records over to an appropriate portable storage media such as an external hard drive. So we would select yes, it does contain portable storage media. Remember that LAC can do carrier-less transfers on a pilot project basis. So if you would like to explore this, speak with your archivist, as we will need to do some sort of temporary workarounds around the web form. The next thing that you'll be asked to fill out here is a digital transfer assessment form. This is the last piece of required documentation that you'll be asked to include with digital transfers on top of the web form that you're seeing and the file inventory of whatever that looks like in your case. So let's move over to the web form now. I will start by mentioning that we are currently revising this form to make it simpler to fill out, so it may look different soon. But the key bits of information will be the same. For instance, the general information here is a lot of the same information you would have provided to your archivist earlier. The physical context of the records, whether they came from a paper file, whether they are born digital or digitized material. When we get into the scope and contact information, this is where you will be asked some key information such as the total extent of the transfer and the total number of digital files included. If you don't know how to find this information, please let us know, as this is crucial data to help all the key business areas at LAC plan their work. The file format information is where you can log that information when you analyze the file formats at an earlier stage of the transfer prep. For instance, if you did run a Droid report using the Droid tool, you should be able to copy much of that information over here to show your archivist as well as our digital preservation staff that all the records are in fact in preferred or acceptable file formats. Next, if you move to the second sheet in this workbook, you'll be presented with a digital physical storage media inventory. If you're only transferring one single hard drive, for example, this is perhaps not as important. However, if you are including multiple carriers, either because it's a very large transfer that doesn't fit on one drive, or because you've segregated digital records based on security classification, filling this out is crucial so we know which files from your inventory are on which carriers. And with that, we will move back to the PowerPoint presentation, and I will pass it over to Martha for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So once again, we've covered quite a lot of information today, but I just want to reassure everyone here as we're wrapping up that there are really just two main points that we would like you to get from all of the things that we've discussed today. Firstly, or I guess for the 22nd time, this presentation, perhaps more actually. So if you were keeping a tally, definitely include that in your feedback for the event. We'd love to hear what it actually ended up being, but talk to your archivist. The better our communication is at absolutely every stage of the record's life cycle, the easier it will be to transfer records when the time comes. And part of that reason is because our needs and your needs are complementary. So as Natasha mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, practice good IAM, and you will find it easier to meet all of our transfer requirements. This also makes it easier for us archivists to determine whether records are archival or not, whether at the point of transfer or before. But also, just if you do encounter mystery situations, things that are difficult, like the 3 different scenarios that we've discussed today, don't hesitate to reach out to your archivist or to the Liaison Center. We won't be able to wave a magic wand and solve all of your problems, but we can use our experience to help focus your efforts and just ensure that we're not duplicating any efforts or minimizing, being as efficient as possible as we move forward with this process. Ultimately, our goal is to make sure that archival records are transferred to LAC so that we can preserve them and people can find them for hundreds of years into the future. And that is the foundation of all of the required information and all of the packaging and electronic records transfer requirements that are listed in the procedures themselves or in the metadata standard. LAC cannot do our work without your contributions. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you for being here and being engaged in this whole process. And also thank you for your patience whenever an archivist responds to one of your very straightforward questions with, "It depends." We look forward to continuing to work with all of you in the years to come. And on the next slide here, we just have a few links to some of the items that we've discussed for your ease of reference when you look back at this presentation deck in the future. And with that, thank you very much, and I will hand it back to Francis. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Natasha, Martha et Brian.